Welcome to The East Angle, a podcast about the East, broadly defined, exploring international relations, politics, and history. When time allows, we will also delve into world events and our shared passion for football. I'm Ra Mason, and this is my co-host, Sherzod Muminov.
Hello and welcome to another episode of The East Angle. Last time in our conversation with Ra, we mentioned that immigration will be our next topic, and immigration it will be this time. We tried to get some students, but it is a very difficult time for graduate, especially the ones who are graduating because they're finishing up their essays. So it was a bit difficult for us to get students. But we have a wonderful colleague, Juvaria Jafri, Dr. Juvaria Jafri, who is a lecturer in international relations in the School of Politics, Philosophy and Area Studies here at the UEA. And my co-host, Ra, will introduce Juvaria to us.
Yeah, I am absolutely delighted to have Juvaria with us. She's an amazing colleague and works on something which is not immigration itself, but I think something which is very important to that topic, and focuses on, she's a political economist, international political economist, and she focuses on the role of finance in development. So some of the terms and areas that she looks at are so central to the way in which all these global systems work. And two things maybe I'd particularly like to hear from Juvaria on to start with are these ideas of financial inclusion and shadow banking. So welcome to the East Angle, Juvaria, and could you chat a bit about that?
Yeah, thanks for the introduction. So yes, as Ra mentioned, I am a political economist. I'm an IR scholar, but I study international political economy, which is a subfield of international relations, and my own particular focus is on financial development. And I know we're talking about immigration, and I'm not a migration scholar, but there are so many overlaps, and hopefully we'll get a chance to discuss that. My work so far has been quite centered on financial inclusion. A large part of it is on what we call fintech, which is financial technology. And when I started doing the research, it was more about microfinance, microcredit, so it had quite a developmental focus. It was about how people who are poor, people in the global south, can access the financial system. And then a lot of that has now come to be very closely linked to what sort of digital technologies are available to make that sort of access available. When I started the project early on, and now I'm doing various iterations of it, I was quite interested in shadow banking. And shadow banking is this term that we use to describe this sort of transformation in the financial system. So I suppose the simplest way to explain it is that back in the day, and for a lot of people still, their perception of what the financial system or what banking is about banks gathering deposits and then making loans out of those.
Right.
And then shadow banking sort of reverses that system. It's sort of when you create products and you bank based on the product itself. So it's called disintermediation. So rather than taking loans, giving out loans based on your deposits, you create products, and that becomes the investment instead of the deposit. So the shadow banking system is absolutely massive. So it's not just about like when you go to Santander or NatWest, it's about all the various instruments that are derivatives or collateralized debt obligations and so on, all sorts of products.
Wow.
That became really, really important when we had the global financial crisis, because that was so blamed.
Yeah. So does that mean then that all of that stuff the shadow banking doesn't have deposits behind it? There's no real money?
There are investments, but very often the product is created before the investment comes in. So you create the product to get the investment. And microfinance and financial inclusion projects became part of that, because you essentially created these products. You gathered money from people who were wealthy or from the global north, and then you created products to lend to the poorest people.
Right.
Okay.
So to link this back slightly to the general topic, so this affects obviously the financial system as a whole. It obviously disproportionately affects people in the so-called global south, and that is obviously also a key push factor in terms of making people or encouraging people to migrate or to affect the system, so we have less kind of equality, right, internationally. So, I mean, how would you say that is having an impact on the way we understand, I guess, the sort of the social world as it is now? Because I think, like you said, most people think, I go to the bank, I pull money out, there's this real money behind it, and so if we just balance the books, then somehow that's going to make, that's the solution. But do all these things actually mean that they're creating a system which is kind of entrenching what we think of as, people that are impoverished, or the global south, or different layers of financing? Is that the issue here?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the fundamental questions of international political economy as a sub-discipline, right? So you realize, or you, when we have introductory modules, so for example, a global political economy module that I teach, we look at the economy as a whole, and we try to understand if there are inequalities built into it. And then when you talk about financial inclusion or microfinance or so on, and you look at the system of shadow banking, which you come to see as quite extractive. It's basically quite wealthy investors in the global north being able to make large sums of money, because microfinance, microlending is expensive, from the poorest people in the global south. So that's one aspect of this global financial system that doesn't work for everyone. So it works for some people. And then that goes back to our migration topic, because if there is a system that is impoverishing, disadvantaging large groups of people from particular parts of the world, what are they going to do about it?
This takes me back to my graduate school years when I also did international politics and international relations. I remember some of the theories, and I've always thought, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, that international political economy tends to be a very Marxist field. Or is it not? I don't know if you're a Marxian scholar, if you don't have to. But what you just described, actually, I don't want to go too deep into the theory, but maybe there are some budding graduate students who are interested in. This sounds like third world theory, right?
Like
A little
dependency
bit.
theory.
Dependency theory, yes. Ra will correct my... Or because, you know, the thing that you talked about, the inequality of the divide between the global, so-called global north, so-called global south, the haves and the have-nots kind of thing. But again, don't let me go into that. Maybe we can return maybe to the topic of global finance and the inequalities of it. I would like to ask you about immigration as a topic. One thing I'd like to mention, your research is fascinating because your research gives us clues about the structural issues that probably cause all these difficulties or all these differences and inequalities that ultimately lead to migration flows from developing countries to the developed countries. But we are also here, I am also your fellow immigrant in this country, also because we also have the personal opinion or personal stance on it. And I would like to start by asking you these two things. So first, why is immigration such a big thing now? Why is everybody who, people even who didn't follow the news or weren't interested, suddenly everyone has to have an opinion on immigration, especially if you are on X or on Facebook. Immigration is such a divisive topic. And secondly, where do you stand on this debate? So those two questions to kick us off.
Okay, so let me answer the last part. So
Okay.
the last part first, because I am a migrant. So you'd expect me to say that yes, I'm quite pro-migration, which I am. But you know, from the political leaders we have in this country, that's not always the case, right? So we're a very diverse country over here, and we've got lots of influential political leaders
The
from
previous
migrant
government
backgrounds,
especially, yeah.
but they
Yeah.
don't necessarily have a pro-migration view, and it's
I would say they had an anti-migration view.
Yeah, I would say fiercely anti in
Yeah,
some cases, right? Yeah.
absolutely, yeah.
Well, we don't have to name names, but
we
the
could.
previous government, the previous government.
Sorry, go on.
But it is a politically salient issue, right? So you
Yeah.
can see them getting traction out of having
Yeah.
those anti-migrant views as well. So definitely it's become something that we discuss a lot, and it is interesting, right? So from the international political economy context, you can talk about crisis, right? So we've been through sort of multiple crises, and you can see the linkages between migration and various forms of crisis. I think what's interesting for me is that when we talk about crises and we talk about migration, sometimes we try to make the link between sort of climate change, refugees, wars, conflict, and so on. But a lot of migration that we see and we don't talk about that much, I think, or maybe it gets obscured, is people like us who are
Economic
maybe not
migrants.
necessarily escaping war or
Or if
climate
we use the Russian
devastation.
phrase, sausage migrants. The migrants who, I mean, it doesn't really translate very well, but in Russian, you have this term with people who actually migrate because they like the sausages in Germany, not because they are hungry or dying or escaping conflict. So, yeah, economic migrants.
Yeah.
So,
So where does that leave you, Juvaria? Because you have such knowledge of this underlying the financial system, and I've read some of your work, which is amazing, about currency manipulation and all this stuff. But does that? I mean, this is fascinating to me, because I kind of expect you to say, yeah, and hence we need to do X, Y, and Z, right, about it. But you seem slightly not ambiguous, but you seem to be saying there's something more complex to the system than that.
Yeah, so I think just coming here, you kind of get thrown into it immediately, right? So I know we're talking about it a lot now, but I came here in 2015. So I think the migration question has always been
Right.
on my mind, right? Because
2015, when it was heating up,
yeah,
just before
and it was
Brexit.
really heating up, yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm a Commonwealth citizen, so I
Right.
actually get to vote,
Ah,
which is
right,
a really
okay.
interesting kind of idiosyncrasy almost in this system.
We won't
So-
ask you, did you vote about Brexit?
But it's but I had to engage with it, right? So
Right.
I really had to think hard about how to vote for this, and there were quite compelling arguments on both sides, and I think that's becoming a lot more apparent now. I think when Brexit happened, you'd lose your credibility if you
Right.
were
Right.
a leaver, right? But
Yeah.
now you can actually talk to people, and they'll talk about their views and so on, and you can see that it's a little more balanced.
Right.
It's not just a bunch of racist xenophobes who were part of the Leave campaign. There were
Yeah.
people with very legitimate grievances, and that sort of discussion is becoming a lot more prominent now, right? There
Right.
is more sympathy for anti-migration views, and that is kind of a mainstreaming of the sort of stuff that we saw going on in 2015, 2016.
Yeah,
Right.
I would
And so
absolutely, I would go farther than that and say that anti-migration, I mean, I'm not talking about racists, because racists have always existed, and racists are quite good, many of them these days, especially on social media, at masking their racism with anti-migration rhetoric, which has become more readily available. You know, anti-migration rhetoric became mainstream. There was a time, we all remember, when it was really not kosher to speak about migration in those terms. Now, it's actually bad if you're a politician and you don't bash the number of migrants coming into the country. But I want to be a little bit provocative and say this, and I would like your opinion on this. Whatever the rhetoric, however bad the bashing, the so-called West, or the so-called, I include also Japan in the West. I mean, it's problematic, but Ra and I, we do that quite frequently.
But I think it's important, because when we talk about the West, we often just look at a map and we're like, okay,
Yeah.
it's Western Europe and North America, and that's basically the West. But that isn't really the West, right?
No.
Conceptually, you've got Japan, you've got South Korea, in a way, you've got Australia, New Zealand.
Absolutely.
So anyway, yeah.
So Japan included, this so-called West will have to have a reckoning. It's having it now, but at some point that reckoning will become a bit more pressing, in which we talked about fertility rates in these countries. South Korea, 0.7 per
0.7,
woman.
yeah.
That is basically, the nation will die out if they don't do anything serious.
Japan is in the same
Japan
direction.
is 1.2,
Italy,
but
same
still really, really, really low. But then let's come back to this country. This country is also maintaining its population because of migration, because the fertility rate here is 1.6. So all of these nations will have to accept migrants, whatever they say. Do you agree or not?
Yeah, I agree on that, and I have to say that despite of everything, when sometimes people ask me, how do you feel as a migrant, and what do you feel? So I'm very upset by racist rhetoric, which is mostly on social media, so you can kind of avoid that. It's okay on a day-to-day basis, but I do feel needed, right? I feel like there's work for me to do over here, and somebody needs to do it. So I don't feel that I'm intruding on anything.
Yeah, absolutely,
as
yeah.
such,
Yeah.
right? And that is because what you're saying is very, very obvious. And I see that on a daily basis. So I live in quite a rural part of Cambridgeshire. And initially, when I moved into this village, I was like, wow, it's actually quite diverse. I see all sorts of people over here. It's not just, white people. And then I realized that most of the people that I see are care workers.
Yeah.
Right.
Because they're much younger, and then I sort of saw them in their cars with their stickers of the care homes and so on. And then you realize that, wow, so here is this quite, old NIMBY-ish
Yeah.
sort of village.
Yeah.
But they're completely reliant on this sort of mini army that comes in every day in their cars and is doing all of this
So do you
work
think,
and
has,
so on.
has that changed their views? Has that changed the villagers' views, do you feel? Like, I don't know how long you've lived there, but can you see like is this actually like a lovely example of integration in one sense?
Yeah, so I think that's quite well documented also, right? Because I think a lot of the polls show that people don't have an issue with care workers and they don't have an issue with NHS workers. They have an issue with all of the other migrants. I mean, I don't know
Who they are.
Well,
specifically.
the scapegoats are the boat people, so-called
Yeah.
boat people. But
Yeah.
statistically, you look at the numbers, and the irony is that Brexit happened to lower the number of the total number or net migration. But net migration has only gone up since Brexit, which means, I mean, it's another thing, another proof that Brexit probably wasn't the right solution in the end. But if you take the number of boat people, however big that number might sound, I don't know the statistic, but if you take the number of boat people and you place it against the number of legal migrants who come to this country, it's just
Minuscule.
It's
Yeah,
minuscule.
it's very small.
It does. I don't think it will make even 1% of the big. Somehow, boat people then get all that slack, from
Yeah, sure. Because they're an
all
easy
the-
target. But I'm still
all the
wondering.
flack.
though-
Sorry, I meant
Yeah,
not
yeah,
slack.
yeah, slack, yeah,
That's
the
my
slack.
bad English.
But I mean, this is why I'm still wondering, because neither of you seem to be saying that you're actually all for all-out open borders. So why not? Why not just open the border and let everybody in?
So I think for me, it's because I just can't imagine what that would look like.
Okay.
Right, so I think some people will tell you that, well, that's kind of what we had before Brexit. It was open borders and people were coming in and out, and it was spectacular, right? When I came in and I talked to my colleagues from Europe, and it was really interesting, right? Because some of them were doing PhDs, or some of them had just come in on a whim, right, to do a job, and then they decided to do a master's, and then they did a
Sure.
PhD, or they did various things. And it was really, really interesting because I had to jump through so many hoops to get there, right? Like I had to spend lots of money,
Yeah.
had to do lots of paperwork, and I'm relatively at that point I was sort of interested and educated, so I could do it myself. But people pay people to do it, right?
Yeah.
So it becomes even costlier. There's a sort of whole industry, which I think from a political economy part I'm really interested in, right? There's like this sort of cottage industry, not even a cottage industry, like quite
It's quite
prolific,
necessary.
Yeah.
It's just to, because I also went through that process, and I went through that process on my own, not because I am so good at filling that form, but because I had a friend who really helped me when he didn't have to. So I'm talking about the immigration advisor for the University of Cambridge, who initially helped me because it was his job. But after I left Cambridge, if I had a question, I could ask him, and he was so kind and nice. That industry has emerged, and we're talking about the long and harrowing and expensive process of even people with PhD level jobs like Juvaria and myself trying to get indefinite leave to remain. Indefinite leave to remain to a non-British ear might sound leave to remain doesn't sound very intuitive, but leave here means permit. So what you would call a green card in America or permanent residence in any other country. But that process is really long, so you have to spend at least 5 years on a work visa or 10 years on any visa before you can apply for indefinite leave to remain. And when you do apply, it's very expensive. Like the fee itself is very expensive. But the reason why people actually try to hire immigration lawyers or advisors is because the process is really also stressful.
Yeah,
it's just
absurd.
incredibly.
It's absurd. I mean, it also affects. I'm a British citizen and was born in Britain, but my partner is from overseas. She's Japanese. That means that she had to do all the same things, and it was almost. It was a nightmare. Like some of the questions that
Kafkaesque is the word.
Like there were questions that my mother and father, who both have A levels in English, could not answer.
Yeah.
On history and geography and all these things.
You're talking about
Life in the UK test.
Like,
Yeah.
It's absolutely nuts.
You know
right?
what? Life in the UK test was probably the most pleasant part of that
Really?
process
Because it's ridiculous, right?
because I'm talking about when you mentioned questions, I remembered the questions in the form. And you know that how bureaucracy works, how forms work. Forms are very uniform, and they have to be. But there are millions of lives and millions of people, and every person's circumstances are different. And sometimes you will have a question which you genuinely want to answer honestly, but you don't know how.
Yeah.
So that's when you need an advisor, because an advisor will have actually faced that question before.
So what is this all about? Is this about money then? Is that cottage industry? Is that about creating, I don't know, like a commercial interest for the British government? Or why make it like that? It's crazy, right?
Yeah, so there's so many layers to it, right? So one part is that they've deliberately, I mean, I'm guessing it's deliberate. They've made it very, very complicated, right? So the paperwork, it's very time consuming and it's incredibly stressful, right? So if you think that, if you're not confident about what you're writing, then you're just, I mean, till, from the moment it goes in till you get a result, you're going to be thinking about it all the time. You'll be second guessing. You'll
This
be
guy
wondering,
was,
like,
definitely.
what did I put there? Should I have written something different? That sort of thing. The other part of it is that so some people pay people to do it. If you were part of an institution like the University of Cambridge, which,
Or most universities have
they
compliance
have a nice,
managers.
they have, and that those jobs are advertised, right?
Yes.
So on jobs.ac.uk, which is one of my favorite websites.
And you know what? Those people are actually, God bless them, they're incredibly helpful. Not just as, advisors who will tell you what to write on the form, but also they often provide that, and I don't know if it's part of their job, but they provide that reassurance that you're doing. And part of the reason why, sorry, Juvaria, I'm kind of answering her question for her, but I had real stress that really, interfered with my day-to-day functioning because of this, because you were so anxious. It's Kafkaesque is a genuine word that applies to this, because of also, if you read the media, and I will single out several newspapers, but most mainstream newspapers, for example, you go on the Guardian webpage, and on the front page you see academic deported because of this. Somebody's papers were wrong, so they didn't get ILR. And that kind of headline, even if when you're not thinking, when you're trying to just live your life, just gives you just so much anxiety. And even when, and Juvaria just mentioned like the really complicated process, but to get to that point, you already have to meet certain criteria. You have to have a job. I think it's 35,000, isn't it?
They keep changing it. Yeah, I think
they
it's
keep changing
35,000.
it. At least 35,000. Then you have to have paid over the past 5 years. You have to have paid NHS surcharge, which used to be £100 a year per person, which is.
I think it's 1,200 now.
Now it's 1,200.
Yeah.
So in the last 5 or
Yeah.
6 years, that went 1,200%.
So that's per person. So
Per
that's
person.
you or your partner, your kids.
And then,
It doesn't matter if it's a baby
Yeah.
or a 70-year-old. Plus, we were exempt from the 35,000 minimum salary because we both had, I think, PhD level jobs. So I had a PhD by the time I applied. I think you also did. But when you get to that point, then the whole thing starts. And when I applied for ILR 4 years ago now, it cost £2,849 per person.
Yeah.
So
Like that.
to go back to your point, so why is it, Ra asked the question, is this to make money?
Yeah,
or
you're talking about the
there
layers. So what were the other layers?
So the worst, the most annoying part for me was when you have to get an appointment to do your fingerprints.
Yes.
And so that's
Biometrics
the fees
appointment.
that you've quoted. That's the part that the Home Office.
So
is
you
paying.
have to pay for
But there are
biometrics
these
separately.
other agencies that are making lots of money, basically just getting your fingerprints.
Right.
Some people can pay them extra to go through their form.
Yeah.
Like you can pay them £30 and they'll just go over your form. So they don't have any authority. They're not decision makers, but they can sort of tell you. I have to say that they're generally quite nice. Some of them.
Yeah.
They're all migrants themselves. Like when
Right.
you go in, you chat with them, and they're from like India or Nigeria, and so on. And they're very much like security guards.
Yeah.
But they're really good with
Sure. With all the
you know,
details, right?
Yeah,
But-
so they check you, they do your biometrics and so on. But you have to get an appointment. There are wait lists for the appointment, so you can't just decide that I've done my form now and now I'm going to go in. And sometimes you have to go to all sorts of random places. Like I've done biometrics at Peterborough.
Yeah.
I've been to various parts of London. I've been to Croydon. I've been to Hemel Hempstead.
Random. So
Random
Hemel
places
Hempstead.
because you just
Heathrow
go where
Airport.
you can
Yeah.
You
get an
get one, right?
appointment.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. I think the point that I think I would make, and I'm sure you will agree, tell me if you disagree, but there is clearly the disincentivizing motive there.
Right.
So even if you meet all the requirements, even if you already have a job, otherwise you wouldn't be here, and before applying for ILR, you have to have a job in this country. So your job, your work visa is the only reason you are here. And if for any reason you lose that job, you have to leave the country. So by the time you come to ILR, it is so complex and so expensive and so stressful that when I was going through this, I thought there must be a reason why it's so complicated. Because, and again, I'm not talking about conspiracies, but there is clearly that the
So is it racism? Is that what this is about? Is it like a xenophobia?
xenophobia,
basically?
probably not racism, because this applies to all foreign citizens: white, black, brown, red,
Okay.
doesn't matter, yellow. If you're a foreign citizen, you can be American, you can be
Sure.
Russian, you can be Japanese.
It's very democratic.
You still have to go. So everybody is
In an
equal.
ironic way.
Everybody's equally, has to go through
Discriminated
that.
against.
Yeah, discriminated against.
Okay.
I mean, you wouldn't call this discrimination because, as I don't remember which Home Secretary it was, but staying in the UK is a privilege. It's not a right. So you can't just
Yeah.
come. And I think Trump's administration is showing that by saying that, by denying, for example, we've had some stories of academics being turned around at the border. Having, say, a European passport is not your right to be in America. So any government can decide not to let you in.
Yeah, but I guess what I'm getting at is, so it is xenophobic, right? It is xenophobic. So, because from our point of view, myself and my partner, we just wanted to get through it, and I don't think either of us thought anything other than badly of the authorities and the experience. We thought this is just terrible, right? Like we're
It's just
married,
stressful.
we've got a child. This is outrageous. What they're going to send her home and
They could.
Exactly,
if,
right?
if you didn't do the form right, yeah.
So I'm wondering, having got it, and I guess getting to the point of citizenship, does it in any way work? Like, do you feel like, oh great, I've done it now? I mean, I'm British, or do you just think this is horrible? Like, doesn't it just make you angry about the state of the country and?
If anything, when I got the ILR, I was really relieved. Not happy, not like not like, oh yes, I did it. Relief, I think, is probably the biggest because of that media frenzy too, because of that you will remember this. When I got this job, Theresa May was Prime Minister, and Theresa May used to be Home Secretary, who came up with this phrase, hostile environment. And hostile environment was, obviously, she was talking about illegal migrants. So she was talking about making Britain hostile to illegals. But the spirit of the times, if you like, or the tone of the media, or the discourses that were, kind of circulating around us were, and a lot of my colleagues would like, what? You paid how much to get a visa? So a lot of the colleagues were just, incredulous. Like, how? Why are we doing this?
Exactly. But I mean, you mentioned, Juvaria, that you feel very needed, and you definitely are. I'll come back to that. But do you also feel relieved, or is there a whole range of emotions, or do you just look at it in a very kind of, what's the word, reflective, objective way? Or?
Yeah, I feel relieved. I feel very grateful actually, because you realize that when you have to stand in a different queue, it's completely different, right? So you mentioned racism in the system. And as Sherzod said, I don't think this system is necessarily racist because, there's all sorts of people. And, when I used to come here, like I think this was 2015, 2016, there'd be a queue for EU and UK citizens, and then there'd be everybody else, right?
Yeah.
So we'd be in the same queue. So if you were on, some
That queue is
third
still
world
there,
passport, yeah, but now they put the e-gates. So
Yeah.
it's literally like all the, whatever you want to call them, advanced industrial
Call them
nations.
what you want to call them. We want to hear that.
They're all cordoned off, and then it's
First
literally
world.
like you
The
feel like
first
I'm,
world.
here in this queue with the wretched of the earth. Right?
I love
Like,
that.
that's
Yes,
literally like
exactly.
what it
To use
feels
Frantz
like.
Fanon's
Yeah.
amazing book
Yeah.
title.
So that part definitely feels racist, right? And when I do the lecture, I do a guest lecture for the contemporary politics class on racism and politics, and then I show them this image of border control.
Yeah.
And very few people know what it is. They're like, but why didn't they just go through the E-gate?
Right.
And a lot of people don't realize that some people can go through the E-gate,
Yeah.
but some people can't.
For those
And that's racist.
who don't know,
Right.
in Britain, if you land in a UK airport, I think there are 12 or 13 countries. I don't remember exactly what they are. So it's not 12, like more definitely, because EU actually comes as one
Yeah.
entity
But
there.
it's the EU and a
So you
bunch of
have
other
you have
selected others.
EU, you have Japan, South Korea, Singapore,
Some of the Gulf
US.
Yeah.
I don't think there is a Gulf state there. No, I don't think
No?
there is a Gulf state. No.
Anyway, it's about
Norway, those countries, which you would probably call the first world, which leads me to another question. Why do we complain about this? Is this because, isn't that natural that when you don't discriminate on that basis, when you let so-called second or third world citizens come without visas, then that would create some complications to nations. You need at some point. I mean, we just it became very emotional, and I was bashing the immigration system. But on the other hand, to answer Ra's question, why don't you open all the floodgates to everyone?
Yeah, well, that
You
was
know what's
actually-
going to happen, right?
Yeah, but that was your question. You're stealing my question. This is also the question I wanted to ask you about. Because what would be effective policies? Because
Yeah.
you both seem to agree that there is some need.
If we
to
move
control.
away from our own
But
personal
I
experience.
don't know if it'll be like opening the floodgates, right? That's what I'm saying. I find it very hard to imagine a world in which it is open, right? So let me give
Right.
you the example of my own family. So if you look at the history of different migration rules and regimes in the UK, it's changed a lot, right? And until the
1971, it was open all the floodgates,
yeah,
right?
so all
To the
it
Commonwealth.
was essentially free movement of the Commonwealth. And then up till the 80s, it was still quite easy for most of the Commonwealth to sort of turn up and spend a few years and apply for settled status or ILR or whatever they called it then. And my grandparents have lived in the UK on various occasions. So in the 60s, and then they just went back to Pakistan. And then they were here again in the 70s because my grandfather was a banker. So he kept getting these sort of different positions and so on. And they never thought to apply for citizenship or any kind of settled status. And, when we got to sort of the 90s or 2000s, when me and my cousins were talking about going abroad and studying and so on, and going through all of these very onerous visa forms and so on, and we'd ask him, we're like, why didn't you just, get us all British citizenship then?
Yeah,
And he said,
yeah.
I didn't think
Because
of
they
it.
didn't
Like,
need
was
it.
not.
Yeah.
We didn't
Two-
need it.
Two historical notes here as the in-house historian. One, Britain really needed that migration. So we kind of talk about the Commonwealth migration after the Second World War as if Britain was being, so generous to the Commonwealth, which it was. But on the other hand, we shouldn't forget that, for example, what in Germany was solved, the problem of labor shortage was solved with the Gastarbeiter program, where you had mostly Turkish, but also other Middle Eastern countries send officially their workers to live in Germany and work there. Britain actually turned to the empire. And Britain itself, British economy, British recovery effort after the war really benefited from that workforce. And the second history lesson maybe, is that listening to you speak, Juvaria, I felt that, yes, passport rules and passport controls have got harder and harder, because 100 years ago, and Tara Zara, the historian Tara Zara, in her book Against the World, gives the example of Stefan Zweig. Stefan Zweig is this Austrian writer, Jewish Austrian writer, who is often brought brought up when people talk about that lost Europe, you know, the Europe before Hitler, the Europe of good, of, you know, civilization, and she talks about how you didn't even need a passport. You didn't need a visa. You needed a passport, but you didn't need a visa. You could just go.
Yeah.
And at the border, they were like, okay, Signor or Monsieur, someone, and then they stamp your document. And since then, with not just with Hitler and with post-war Europe and everything else, and currently with this crazy world in which the migrant is the first scapegoat, suddenly, you know, you realize how hard it is now to move from A to B, which, if by any accounts, if you look at the development of civilization, should be the opposite.
Yeah.
Right? Because everything has got better, immigration has got worse. And this actually really strikes me as something that I cannot explain from a historical viewpoint. That's why I have to turn to my political scientist or social scientist colleagues to explain this. Why? Again, going back, I feel I'm going back to my first question. Why is immigration such a hot topic? But how do you explain that, the fact that each nation, especially the so-called first world nations, they feel they really need to tighten the screws?
Yeah. On that, we will take a quick break and then we'll come back for a last couple of questions and get Juvaria's thoughts on some of the more tricky aspects of the topic. Okay, welcome back. So for the last part, I think, I'd really like to talk or get your thoughts on this idea of post-truth and of what's going on in the social media world, because you mentioned that there's a lot of racism online and that you can kind of avoid that. But we also mentioned the fact that governments don't seem to be responding very effectively to immigration as an issue. So is part of the problem all of this disinformation and misinformation that we get?
Yeah, just for the benefit of the viewers who don't know what post-truth is, can you briefly...
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So post-truth is, I guess, this idea that a lot of people associate with Trump administration and the sort of MAGA movement in particular, but elsewhere as well, where you have massive access to all kinds of media. Everybody has access to it. And so in a way, at some point in the last 5 to 10 years, we've gone from thinking there is an absolute truth and we just need to find records of it or recording of it or footage of it, to thinking that anything that's said may or may not be the truth, and possibly even that the truth just accounts or just amounts to whatever it is that you believe or you interpret.
So fragmentation of truth is another term that is used when you just no longer know what is true.
Right.
There is so much information from so many sources that you just forget what you really were looking for.
But shouldn't that actually empower us? Shouldn't that give us the tools, give us access to the information that we can then make our own judgments about a topic, even a topic as complex as migration? No?
Tough question, yeah?
Yeah, tough question. So can I just ask, I know earlier when you were sort of formulating these themes, you said misinformation and disinformation.
Yeah.
So what's the difference between
There's a
misinformation?
difference.
So to my mind, misinformation is where you are disseminating information which is incorrect, but not knowing that that's the case. So it's misinformation because it's factually wrong, it's not true.
Okay, so for example, when you say that most of the migrants have come here on boats.
Yeah, somebody might say that. But if there's two ways they might say that. One way might just be because they've heard it from someone and that becomes misinformation. But there's also disinformation, which is the deliberate stoking of arguments or of a particular position. So there are those, for example, we think of in the more kind of fascist or populist realms, who deliberately talk about migrants coming on boats to
Or
try
for
and
example,
persuade people that it's a threat to the...
Just to give an example, last year there were riots in this country. And the initial information about who killed 3 little girls was that some of those outlets were saying, or some of those people on social media were saying that he was a migrant. Deliberately.
So that's disinformation.
Or
Because you
saying that he was a Muslim migrant.
Right.
Which was wrong.
Right.
I think he might have been a migrant. I'm not sure if
No, he wasn't. He was born here.
he was born here,
Yeah.
and he was not Muslim. But because of that, a lot of people became very angry.
Right.
Which which is exactly what the people who said or who disseminated this information were aiming at, because that is the goal, to to really create wrong emotions or to create strong emotions in which people then fight and, I don't know, like they riot.
But haven't people always done this? I mean, there's always been people that have made up stuff, right?
The scale, though.
So do you think the difference now is that, well, I mean, one thing that is very obvious over here is that there's a very strong right-wing bias in the press. I don't know if you agree with that.
Well, I think it depends what you call right wing.
Do you think that's different now? Do you think, as someone who's lived here for much
it's
longer than I
changed,
have,
but what do you mean by right wing? Because I'm never sure what that term means now. The right has become the left.
Two political scientists talking about definitions. I'm just going to keep my counsel here.
So, I would just associate a certain set of views with the right wing.
Right. Okay.
So views on the economy, views on society, views on culture, which are quite conservative and more resistant or skeptical, at least, of change. And within that sort of right-wing set of views, anti-immigration fits in quite naturally.
Right. Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So the right wing is less likely to be pro-migration.
Yeah, I would agree with all that.
And they're more open to narratives in which migration is portrayed negatively.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's a very good definition. And if you want my opinion, I agree with you. That I mean, speaking about this country, but also you could probably say about the world, that the debate has shifted to the right, more to the right than, for example, compared to 20 years ago when I first came to this country. It was a completely different country. The past is a foreign country.
Are you saying then that it's that right leaning which is being picked up by social media outlets, and that's like, in other words, is that shift to the advantage of those that use social media and disseminate information through social media?
I mean, it's to the advantage of certain groups of people, and a lot of them are gaining political advantage. But I think it's also important to mention over here that there are material reasons for it, right? That's why there's more sympathy. And, probably the most straightforward description of that is about austerity.
Okay.
Right? So you had these massive waves of austerity after the 2007 global financial crisis, and we were supposed to come out of austerity, and we've had prime ministers tell us that it's over, but it's not over.
Right.
And then we had other forms of crises which have kind of
cost of living.
Well, Brexit, COVID, and all the other things.
Yeah. So we have had various forms of austerity, even though it might not be called that always. And because of that, migration is being seen as the major problem.
Right.
Whereas the problem is basically that there's been cuts in funding. There's been
and that these migrants are coming and taking our places in the queue for the NHS, and they're taking the beds in the hospitals and things like that.
So this narrative of scarcity has become very powerful.
Right. Okay.
Right? So it was easier to resist it earlier, but now when you see that there are things going on in hospitals, schools, so on, that lead you to believe that.
Yeah, there's food banks in Norwich, right? I mean, people are not rich. I mean, there is a genuine cost of living crisis. But I'm still a little bit confused about how so many people seem to be convinced by the idea that this is caused by migrants.
Well, let's not forget, talking about the shift to the right, and we're not so much talking about mainstream media, although mainstream media, and again, I am left-leaning, and you know this quite well. But I'm also more impartial than many people when it comes to Britain, because for a long time I didn't think I would live here when I was a PhD student or a postdoc. And in academia, you never know where you will end up. So I wasn't so invested in this country. So I still remember 7-8 years back when Brexit happened, when I had no say on Brexit, I could observe from certain distance, and if I compare, BBC even has shifted to the right. And I think a lot of people will agree with me. Reform voters will probably disagree with me. They still think that BBC is the bastion of leftism, of wokeism, etc. But let's not just talk about mainstream media. Let's not forget who owns one of the biggest social media platforms. I mean, let's talk about X, and talk about the shift of that person. The Democratic voting, the Democratic supporting Elon Musk, who then suddenly became a right-wing figure,
Okay, but I mean, I would still come back then in that case. to the issue of, we seem to have gone full circle, but it's come back surely to the issue of racism. I mean, something like that, that's not just about scarcity, is it? Is it really just about scarcity? Is it about people thinking they don't care if you're black, brown, yellow, whatever, if you've come to this country, you're somehow taking resources off a population that was already here. But I'm not convinced. I mean, you mentioned the fact that the migrant who started the riot, or was framed as starting the riots, was a Muslim. Is there not also a kind of religious and ethnic aspect to this?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is, huge increases in Islamophobia, or whatever your preferred term is, anti-Muslim hatred, or whatever you want to call it. And there's definitely a very sort of pervasive white supremacist agenda, if you want to use that terminology, because, and you see that in Europe, you see that with the recent sort of successes in elections in Europe, of course in the US, and that's a big part of it, right? And there is this kind of coming together of these white supremacist ideas, ethno-nationalism. A huge part of the Israel-Palestine debate is a lot of support, a lot of sympathy for Israel comes from ethno-nationalists, right, who like this idea.
Lots of Indians suddenly who are anti-Muslim for their Indian reasons are supporting Israel because they hate Muslims, and it happens. In a way, I still kind of prefer to take the more detached view in saying that the differences that are targeted are always fluid. Let's not forget that 150 years ago, that scapegoat in this country, the scapegoat that we are now talking about Muslims being scapegoats, which they are, or during Hitler's time, Jews being the ultimate scapegoats, the refugee, anybody who thought about a refugee in the 40s thought about a Jewish person who is trying to escape for their lives. And 150 years ago, probably, or 100 years, even not 100, but 150 years ago, it was the Irish in this country, and again, you can see how race is maybe important, but I wouldn't really stoke everything on race, because Irish people are white, and racially there are not much in terms of difference. But any difference in a society that is so divided, that is so tired and angry, and there's lots of economic strife, and we talked about food banks, and in this country now, you even if you work, some people actually, some nurses actually using food banks, or other people in other jobs. So when you have economic problems, and that's what populism actually what's the word, preys on. Populists prey on this kind of thing when you have deep, difficult structural issues, which you can't solve just like that. It takes time, takes patience, takes money, but it's easier to scapegoat someone and say, you know what, it's the migrants, it's the Irish, it's the Jews, it's the Muslims, or any other group.
Sure. So my final question for you, Juvaria, based on that, is exactly that. So what should be done about it? Like from a political economist point of view, if you had the reins to power, what would be the policies that you would be kind of encouraging them to implement?
Okay, so there's the political economy view, right, in which I would maybe tell you on what the structure of the global economy needs to be like, right? And I think, there is a consensus that it's not working, and that's part of the problem. But if you're asking specifically about what type of policies do we need in this country,
well, that as well,
to sort of
both
make this a less heated issue, right? In that case, I think, again, more openness, more information about what kind of jobs we need people to do, what would actually happen if migration completely dried up, what would happen to all the people who need care workers, people working in the NHS. I also think a very long overdue conversation is about the migrants that, I don't want to say we don't need them, but there are lots of people who are doing food delivery, and that seems like a very extractive, oppressive sort of profession. They seem to have very, very bad working conditions, and there are basically benefits for the big tech companies, right? So these are essentially companies that are headquartered in Silicon Valley, who are making lots and lots of money because people are delivering food or driving their taxis or whatever.
Techno-feudalism is the term that we use.
Exactly. And
Yanis Varoufakis' term.
And I would really like to have maybe a bigger conversation about that. So there are the really important jobs that we definitely need, but I don't know, what would our society be better if we couldn't get a fried chicken at
probably would
midnight,
be better, right?
You can talk about a lot of things that could be I think this government is doing, or at least taking the steps in the right direction. If you don't want migrants, or if you don't want so many migrants, then train some of the people here, or create incentives for people to take those non-glamorous jobs like care workers. Why does Britain have, say, shortage of nurses? Why does Britain have shortage of care workers? Why does Britain always has? 20 years ago when I came here, there was 100,000 doctors needed at any point. So this is not a new problem. So it has, these are structural issues. So populists will tell you that they will give you the easy answers to the tough questions, but structural issues, I guess. Again, I'm not a...
Really, instead of asking populists, they should be asking political economists.
They should. So brilliant research that is being done at the UEA, among other places. So, shall we take another break? Okay, shall we take another break and then come back to speak about easier topic of sport? Okay, we are back from the break. We have discussed somewhat emotionally some of those topics on immigration, but now we would like to talk about, as is the tradition,
on this podcast.
On this podcast, we usually talk about football,
just to lighten the mood.
Yeah, but we can talk about any ball game, so it doesn't have to be football. So, Juvaria, tell us about your involvement in sport. Any involvement? Do you play? Do you watch?
Oh, okay.
If you do, what games do you watch? Do you have a favorite team?
And is sport the answer to all our immigration problems?
Oh wow! So I think sport is a nice way of looking at multiculturalism in action. But I am a little wary of how people sometimes talk about how you can have the best players in football and you can just bring them in from any country and so on. So I just think we should be a bit wary of the narrative in which you have only the best people coming in. Like, isn't that an immigration question?
The best and the brightest.
Well, right? Is it just about the best and brightest?
Point-based system actually also tries to get all the best and the brightest, not
That's
just...
very true.
Yeah.
That's very true. I mean, in cricket, it's quite interesting locally because there's a whole kind of crisis amongst small teams, right? Because you've got urbanization, depopulation in certain kind of areas, and teams go they go bust, or but because they're relying entirely on a growing population of mostly Southern Asian players. And so what was once, I think, and I've played cricket in places where there was a lot of kind of racist tension between, those of Asian origin and those of local origin. But actually now it's becoming almost the opposite. Like there's this encouragement of trying to think, maybe we could, and we've actually seen across Norfolk teams, lots of teams try and kind of engage with the local councils and invite particularly those migrants from Afghanistan and countries that are, facing obviously kind of crises from war or whatever else. And there's an actual deliberate attempt to recruit cricket players from those sectors, which is a sort of strange or a recent transformation, I think, of the whole.
But is that because the local people don't want to play cricket? So
yes,
so
because there's not enough there's not enough families in these little villages or whatever that keep having cricketers. So there's it's dying out in some cases, and it's only being kept alive, or at least it's helping to be kept alive partly by a younger immigrant population.
Yeah, I find that so fascinating. So on the village green, sometimes you see these matches, and they're all migrants, mostly South Asian. So it's kind of this sort of nod to the Commonwealth that once existed, because that's where cricket came from. So it's quite there's something fascinating about seeing it. But what I blame is Sky, right?
Right.
Because you can't watch it, right? So a lot of people have never watched cricket.
So true.
These days, all kinds of companies, Amazon is among them. So there was a time when you could just watch Champions League on TV.
Yeah.
Or Premier League on TV.
Yeah.
Or FA Cup is probably the last bastion, last cup that you can still watch on Freeview.
Yeah.
But you're right.
No, it's so true. And it kind of goes back to the point we were making before, and the point you were making about big tech companies. That's another part, I think, of this kind of techno-feudalism.
Yeah.
If we actually talk about government policies, the government could do a lot more to provide viewable sports. And that would change the whole dynamic around sports that are losing popularity.
Because ultimately the philosophy behind any bowl game is team building, community. All these football teams, and I mean, I know football more than I know cricket, but all football teams have some form of community engagement. And it is a great way to remind people, again, like, despite all the division, despite all that, all the post-truth hatred that goes around in the world, when people meet face to face on the football pitch, on the cricket ground, or anywhere else, or on the village green, ultimately those differences, those fluid differences, don't really matter, right?
Yeah.
So look at the Premier League. Ra, we talk about the Premier League a lot. Do you see many local people, fans of local smaller teams, which have now not just Premier League but lower leagues, have all become very rich now? Even smaller English clubs have a lot of money. Do you see lots of local supporters protest against all these immigrant players coming to play for their teams?
Not at all. It's actually the reverse. And you've got teams like Oxford that, deliberately target like Indonesia as a market. So they get Indonesian players in, even if the players are not necessarily at the standard that they need to be for, say, the championship. They get them because you get huge commercial backing. Indonesia's a massive market. So there's lots, and you see the same with South Korea, Japan, players being brought in just to try and drive
to sell shirts.
I mean,
if we're cynical, yeah.
So what would happen if you had a Hum Trophy for cricket?
Yeah, I would love to do it. So the Hum Trophy is a fantastic trophy that all of us should be playing in.
Okay.
But I'm going to shame Sherzod by telling him that he's the only player here who hasn't played it. So it's a fantastic tournament. It's basically football, but there's a lot of people, right, who don't really play football that come and play.
It's evident in a few minutes after the kickoff. So on that very positive note, that we somehow always end on this note that sport is going to save us, all of us, that in a way sport probably is going to save the world from going completely crazy, because sport can also be a steam valve for a lot of anger that is pent up, especially among the male populations. Again, we see that quite a lot. But sports is good. So let's hope that
it saves the world.
It saves the world. So thank you.
So on that note, thank you
Juvaria.
so much, Juvaria. It's been an amazing guest. Thank you as ever to my co-host.
Sorry for being a bit too emotional. This one actually was cutting really close to my own personal experience, but I think we had a good, slightly chaotic, but a good conversation.
There's so much more to talk about, so I think we'll
maybe we will invite you for another episode. Yes.
Brilliant. Thank you.
And thanks to all the people who have come to this point. If you're still watching us on YouTube, please like and subscribe, and we will continue to have these conversations with colleagues and students. And until the next one. This podcast has been produced with support from the Faculty of Arts and Humanities at the University of East Anglia, UEA. The hosts are grateful to the UEA Media Production team. Technical assistance has been kindly provided by the technicians at the UEA Media Suite, who have also engineered and edited this episode. The views expressed in this podcast belong solely to those who express them and do not represent the views of the university or its affiliates.